And over time, we can see that history matters. So, how has Earth's history affected how species disperse? We talked about biogeography and some of those patterns across these continents when they were in different configurations. And so, at the very bottom of this figure, you can see what was called Gondwana and Laurentia, and those were two supercontinents that were that existed about 300 million years ago, and they kind of smooshed together into what's called Pangea about 220 million years ago. And then about 120 million years ago, Pangea broke apart and the climate became more mild and temperate. And then about 3 million years ago, you start to see the continents in the current configuration where we have North and South America joined by a land bridge. And then we also start to see some worldwide glaciation. So this land bridge that connected North and South America only really formed about 25 million years ago. Um, and and that led to some interesting patterns of species distribution across the land bridge. Other land bridges show you kind of similar things. So there's some really cool patterns we can see when we start looking at species distributions across the globe. One of those things is something that Alfred Russel Wallace found in the Malay Archipelago. And Alfred Russel Wallace was a contemporary of Darwin, and he was working on evolutionary theories of natural selection at the same time that Darwin was. And so we often talk about both Darwin and Wallace as kind of putting forward the theory of evolution. So really, a really interesting, very young natural historian who was traveling the world and making collections in his 20s. So what he found when he was in Borneo and New Guinea is this distinct separation between what he considered Asian species and what were considered Australian species. And it was like this really abrupt line, like you had a whole community as shown in green. And then when you just kind of moved across to one little island, the whole community was very distinct and different. And what we found after we had the kind of capacity to learn this was a really deep ocean trench right along the red dotted line called the Wallace Line. And this ocean trench separated these land masses even during times when the sea levels were much lower. And so when sea levels were much lower, organisms were able to move around among all of these islands kind of equally, but they weren't able to cross the Wallace Line. And so that's why we see this really interesting separation between um, marsupials in Australia and parts of Indonesia, and then other organisms in the more kind of Asian group. So once humans were able to really move species around the world, we started introducing species to new environments. And some species who get introduced to a new environment are considered invasive. And an invasive species is one that really just kind of takes over and starts pushing native species out. And so, for example, humans have inadvertently spread quite a few organisms around the globe. Starlings, as shown on the top, were introduced to North America because they were Shakespeare's favorite bird, and they have since pushed a lot of other native birds out of their ranges, and they have become a dominant species here. Kudzu is a viney plant that was introduced from Japan as food for goats, cows, and pigs, and to control erosion, and has taken over vast areas of the US in the southern part of the US. And then Scotch broom is an invasive species that has taken over lots of areas here in the Pacific Northwest. It was introduced as an ornamental because it has these bright yellow flowers, but it turns out that it's a it's a nitrogen fixing plant, and it can shoot its seeds really far, so it spreads very fast. So some of those invasive species would be some of the biotic or factors that a species might encounter. So then biotic and abiotic factors can interact with one another. And so an example from the textbook talks about invasive Argentine ants and how they have the ability to outcompete native ants, even though the native ants are much larger than them. And the question is why? So the experiment had basically a bunch of plots, and they counted ants in dry plots where there were native ants present, and in dry plots where the native ants were removed, in irrigated plots with native ants present, and in irrigated plots where the native ants were removed. And after 12 weeks, they went back and they remeasured invasive ant activity. And what they found was that there were there were increased invasive ants, especially in the irrigated plots. That there weren't as many in the dry plots, but there were even more in the irrigated plots where the native ants were removed. And so this kind of interacting force between the abiotic and biotic factors can really influence how organisms experience their environments. So, yeah, what do you conclude from the study? Well, I kind of gave that one away. Sorry. But how do you think it was analyzed? So look at the graph and pause the video, take a minute, and try to figure out how would they analyze this interaction. Okay, well, there's a couple ways they could, but hopefully you were thinking about a t-test for the dry plots, present versus removed, and a t-test for the irrigated plots, present versus removed. Or you could compare the all combined dry plots to irrigated plots using a t-test. Or if I had taught you this, you could use an analysis of variance to compare all four to one another, but we didn't really get into that in statistics yet. Okay, so then climate. What's the difference between weather and climate? Well, climate is the prevailing long-term weather condition at a spot, and weather is a specific short-term atmospheric condition that you experience day to day. So the weather outside is rainy, even though we live in a climate that might be maritime. And why does climate vary around the globe? Well, it has to do with sunshine and the angle of incident sunshine. So at high latitudes, the angle of incoming sunlight is much lower. And so there's a smaller amount of sunlight per unit area than at the equator. It also has to do with winds and prevailing winds, and ocean currents, and how the atmosphere, these big atmospheric circulation patterns. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about all of these things. The first one is atmospheric circulation. So there are these big cells called Hadley cells, Ferrel cells, and polar cells that move air currents around the globe. And they move air from the surface up into the height of the troposphere. And there are trade winds that blow around the Earth and create some of our prevailing winds. And these things in combination create what's called the intertropical convergence zone. And so what happens is that sun heats up air at the equator, which causes the air to rise. And then as it rises, it drops all of its precipitation. So that's why it's really hot and wet right at the equator. And then once it drops its precipitation, it moves toward about 30 degrees north and south. And then the air falls back down. And that air that falls back down is very dry, which is why you might find deserts at about 30 degrees north and south. Then you have similar Ferrel cells that move across the surface of the landscape and pick up moisture, and then you lift back up right between the Ferrel cells and the polar cells. And again, you get a big dump of precipitation in the high tropics and the low tropics in the southern hemisphere, or sorry, not tropics, the high temperate zones. And that's partly why we get some of these patterns across the Earth. And then seasonality, why are there seasons on the Earth? Well, it has to do with the tilt of the Earth's axis. And so if the Earth was straight up and down, it would move around the sun and there would be no seasonal changes. But because the Earth's axis is at a 23.5 degree tilt, that makes the northern and southern hemispheres either closer to the sun or further away from the sun as the Earth moves around the sun. And so you get the southern hemisphere facing the sun at its most direct angle in December, and the northern hemisphere facing the sun at its most direct angle in the middle of June, which gives us our summer in June, and it gives the southern hemisphere its summer in December. And then we get fall and spring in March and September, respectively. And you can look at the pattern of the setting, the midday sun as it moves through the sky. This is called an analemma, and it crosses this, kind of makes this figure 8 pattern that crosses at the equinoxes. And so we're heading down from the equinox down towards the winter solstice which will happen in the middle of December, and then you'll start moving your way back toward the top of this pattern in the summertime. Okay, take a 10-minute break and come back to the next